picture this. We're in ancient Rome, somewhere around the year 47 AD. Torches flicker against marble walls, shadows crawl over carved columns, and music drifts through the corridors of the imperial palace on the Palatine Hill. In one room, senators murmur anxiously about grain supplies and provincial revolts. In another, slaves hurry with trays of wine. And in the center of this whole machine, whispered about in every corner of the city, is a young empress with a reputation so extreme that later writers would claim she could outwork the entire red light district of Rome. Her name is Valeria Messalina. If you believe the ancient gossip, she was Rome's ultimate pervert, forcing noblewomen into public brothels, running all-night competitions against professional sex workers, and cheating on the emperor so brazenly that she literally married another man while her husband was out of town. But how much of that is true, and how much is a 2,000-year-old smear campaign? Let's dig in. Messalina was born around 17 to 20 AD into the inner circle of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. She wasn't some random beauty plucked from the crowd, she was deeply plugged into the family tree. Through both parents, she was a great-granddaughter of Octavia, sister of Augustus. That made her a cousin to Caligula and to the boy who would later become Nero. In other words, she came from the top shelf of Roman nobility. By about 38 AD, when she was still a teenager, Messalina married Tiberius Claudius Nero Germanicus, better known to us as Emperor Claudius. At that time he wasn't emperor yet. He was the limping, stuttering, bookish uncle nobody expected to rule anything. Claudius was about 47, twice divorced, and regarded by much of his family as a harmless embarrassment. Their marriage was almost certainly arranged for political reasons, tying Claudius tighter into the Julian line. But from Messalina's perspective, she just hit the Roman version of the power lottery. When Caligula was assassinated in 41 AD, and the Praetorian Guard dragged Claudius out from behind a curtain and declared him emperor, Messalina woke up as empress of the known world, and she was still probably not even 25. You won't believe how fast the stories start after that. Our main sources for Messalina's life are three male writers, Tacitus, Suetonius, and the poet Juvenal, all writing decades after her death, under emperors who had good reasons to make Claudius and his wives look ridiculous. None of them liked powerful women. All of them knew that sex sells, so when they talk about Messalina, they dial everything up to 11. According to these sources, Messalina is not just unfaithful, she's insatiable. Juvenal, in a famously nasty satire, claims that the empress used to sneak out of the palace at night with a blonde wig on her head, go to a brothel, and work under an alias until she'd exhausted every client, then stagger home at dawn still burning with desire. Pliny the Elder repeats a rumor that she once competed with Rome's top prostitute in a contest and won by sheer stamina. Is any of that literally true? Probably not. Even some conservative modern historians admit it reads more like angry fanfic than reportage. But the fact these stories circulated at all tells you how Romans wanted to picture her, as a woman whose sexuality had broken every boundary of class, decency, and gender roles. And that's the key. In Roman moral ideology, elite women were supposed to be the guardians of the household's dignity, modest, loyal, and visibly controlled. Sex was allowed inside marriage, for babies, for alliances, not as a public power play. It was fine for emperors to have mistresses and attend wild banquets. It was terrifying for the empress to be portrayed as doing the same. So when Messalina starts taking lovers, and we can be pretty confident she did, the gossip machine doesn't just say she cheated, it says she turned the entire class system upside down. Let's shift the camera to the Palatine Hill. Claudius is busy trying to run the empire. He's old enough to be Messalina's father, devoted to her, and according to our sources, more than a little blind to what's going on in his own house. Messalina, meanwhile, has two big advantages. First, she's produced an heir, Britannicus, born in 41 AD, plus a daughter, Octavia. That gives her enormous symbolic power as the mother of the future emperor. Second, she has the ear of Claudius and the support of key freedmen in the palace bureaucracy. If she wants someone promoted or eliminated, she can often make it happen. Tacitus and Suetonius describe a long list of men Messalina supposedly took as lovers and then destroyed when they became inconvenient. Whether that list is accurate or padded for drama, there are documented cases where her name appears in the paperwork. For example, the senator Appius Silanus, stepfather to Claudius's daughter Claudia, is executed early in Claudius's reign after being accused of plotting against the emperor. Tacitus flat-out claims Messalina fabricated the charges because he rejected her advances. True? Maybe. Convenient? Definitely. What we do see clearly is that Messalina's circle benefits as rivals fall. Estates confiscated from condemned aristocrats often end up in her hands or those of her relatives. She reportedly pushes for the downfall of Julia Livilla, Caligula's sister, and of her own cousin, Poppaea Sabina the Elder. Every time, the official charges are things like adultery or moral corruption. In a regime where sexual accusation equals political death, Messalina is portrayed as both player and symbol of that system. Now, about those terrifying sexual practices. Ancient gossip insists Messalina didn't just sleep around in private. She dragged Rome's elite into her games. One story has her forcing upper-class women to register as sex workers and serve in a brothel she controlled, turning noble matrons into commodities for her amusement and power. Modern scholars are extremely skeptical of this one. For a start, there's no solid contemporary legal record of such mass registrations, which would have been explosive politically. Instead, it looks like a nightmare fantasy. Elite male writers projecting their fears about what happens if women like Messalina get too much influence. The idea of a matron turning other matrons into prostitutes is basically the Roman patriarchy's worst fever dream, but the fact that people even believe the story tells you a lot. To Romans, Messalina becomes the embodiment of corrupted authority, a woman who uses her sexual freedom to humiliate other aristocrats and undermine the social order. Whether she actually did that is almost secondary. The scandal does the work either way. Then comes the plot twist worthy of a prestige TV finale. 547 to 48 AD, Messalina has a new favorite, Gaius Silius, a handsome, ambitious senator, described by Tacitus as the most beautiful of the young nobility. According to our sources, this isn't just another fling, this is serious. Tacitus claims she forces Silius to divorce his wife and carry on a very public affair with her, even adopting her children with Claudius into his household as if rehearsing a new family. That alone is dangerous enough. But you won't believe what happens next. While Claudius is away at Ostia inspecting the harbour works, Messalina and Silius allegedly do the unthinkable. They get married. Not in some hidden bedroom ceremony either. Tacitus describes an all-out wedding party in the imperial gardens, with priests, witnesses, feasting, the works. Messalina shows up in full bridal dress. Guests bring gifts. Silius parades as her new husband, while Claudius is still very much alive and legally married to her. On paper, that's not just adultery. That's bigamy and a direct challenge to Claudius's legitimacy. If the story is even half true, it looks a lot like a coup attempt disguised as a scandalous love affair. What was the plan? Some historians think Silius and his allies hoped to push Claudius aside and take power himself, with Messalina as the link to the imperial bloodline. Others suspect the whole marriage was more performative, a drunken mockery of Claudius that got out of hand. The ancient writers naturally frame it as the ultimate expression of Messalina's uncontrollable lust. Either way, it was politically suicidal. Claudius's freedman advisors, particularly Narcissus, realize that if Messalina and Silius consolidate their alliance, they are toast, so they move fast. While Claudius is still at Ostia, Narcissus confronts him with the news. According to Tacitus, they don't even lead with the sex. They lead with the legal bombshell, your wife has married another man. Then they march Claudius back to Rome with a detachment of troops, making sure he hears only their side. By the time the emperor arrives, Silius and his alleged co-conspirators are already rounded up and executed. Messalina is hiding in the gardens of Lucullus, pleading for a meeting, hoping her usual tears and charm will save her. This time they don't. Tacitus paints an almost theatrical death scene. Messalina's mother stands beside her, silently refusing to help her stall for time. A centurion arrives with orders. The empress, who once terrorized the capital with her supposed appetites, suddenly can't bring herself to do the dignified Roman thing and fall on her own sword. The officer has to finish the job. She dies in 48 AD, probably still in her late 20s. Claudius reportedly eats dinner in stony silence that night, then orders that her name and statues be removed from public view. So what do we do with all this? Was Messalina really some uniquely depraved monster? Or did she just lose a high-stakes game of palace politics where sex was one of the tools on the table? Modern historians are divided, but a growing number argue that her reputation tells us more about Roman anxieties than about the real woman. First, remember who's writing the history. Tacitus, Suetonius, and Juvenal all lived under later emperors who wanted to distance themselves from the messiness of the Julio-Claudian court. Trashing Claudius and his empress as clowns and degenerates made the current regime look sane by comparison. Second, Roman elite culture had a nasty habit of attacking powerful women through sexual slander. If a woman close to the throne was active in politics, she almost automatically got labeled promiscuous, manipulative, and dangerous. That pattern hits Livia, Agrippina, and others too, not just Messalina. And third, some of Messalina's supposed terrifying practices only appear in later, more sensational sources, or in texts that are clearly playing to an audience that loves scandal. Even the recent wave of biographies with titles like Rome's Most Scandalous Empress often admit, in the footnotes, that they're navigating a minefield of exaggeration. That doesn't mean she was innocent. She almost certainly had affairs. She almost certainly used her position to enrich her family and crush rivals. She may well have gambled on Silius as a replacement emperor and lost spectacularly. In a court where men did similar things all the time, her biggest crime might have been doing it as a woman, and doing it in a way that left other powerful men feeling humiliated. So when later writers sit down to tell her story, they don't just say she plotted or she was ambitious. They turn her into a symbol, the empress whose lust was so monstrous that it nearly toppled Rome. It's propaganda with staying power. 2,000 years later, we're still repeating the headlines. Most perverted empress, the nymphomaniac of Rome, the woman who slept with 25 men a night. We rarely stop to ask who wrote those lines in the first place, or what they were trying to accomplish. But once you start asking, the whole picture shifts. Instead of just a lurid character in someone else's scandal anthology, Messalina becomes something more complicated. A teenager married off for dynastic reasons, thrust into unimaginable power, navigating a court full of assassins and opportunists, playing a dangerous game with the limited tools a woman could wield in a male-dominated system, family ties, patronage networks, and yes, her own sexuality. In the end, the terrifying sexual practices tell us less about what she literally did in bed, and more about how deeply Rome feared a woman who refused to stay in her assigned box. And that's the uncomfortable part. Because while we've dropped the togas and the marble, the tactic of destroying women's reputations through sexual rumor, that still shows up in politics, media, and everyday life. The vocabulary has changed. The underlying move hasn't. So the next time you see a thumbnail shouting about Rome's most perverted empress, remember that behind the shock value sits a very old question. What happens when a woman near the center of power stops being quiet? And how far will her enemies go to make sure history never lets her forget it? If this deep dive into the legends and realities around Valeria Messalina gave you a new perspective on how scandal works in every era, hit that like button, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and subscribe for more stories from the corners of history, where power, rumor, and human messiness collide.